Welcome to the Desert Sanctuary with Carl and Laura Forehand.
Often when we have doubts about religion or simply want to ask questions, it can feel like we are wandering out into the desert.
We would like to invite you to join our sanctuary, the Desert Sanctuary.
We've tried to pick guests that would resonate with and challenge us and our fellow seekers here in the desert.
We believe that a key to the journey is to keep asking good questions, and we believe that all stories are sacred.
Our hope is that you will find life and healing for your body and mind, and that you will be able to be where you are and be who you are.
And now, here is our show. Hi, welcome back again to the Desert Sanctuary podcast. We are continuing with our third installment with Larry and Jill Jordan. This has been such a delightful conversation and really eye-opening and mind-expanding. I'll speak for myself. So, and even in the midst of recording, so before we hit, or after we hit stop, but before we hit record again, having a lot of really rich conversations. So I really appreciate you both being here and giving us your time to discuss these things. So I'm going to kick it over to Carl, though. Let you get us started on this third installment.
Yeah, if we thought people could endure it, we would just have the microphone on for like 3 hours here and record all the side conversations, because sometimes they're just as good as the ones that are a little more rehearsed. But we love Larry and Jill. They've been to our house. They've helped me work on my ceiling. I was really scared when Larry was on the ladder, but he was learning some new skills, and he did great, and he helped out tremendously. And just having them here during my 60th birthday was great. Hopefully we get to do something like that again real soon. So Larry has a book called The Way. And it's not a dogmatic evangelical book, as the basic title suggests, The Way, but it's much more than that, and it explores all avenues of things we're talking about today. Also, Jill is a great artist, and I want to encourage you to look for her and try to find her art. And maybe before we begin today, in just a minute, Jill, tell us a little bit more about your art, okay? We've been talking about truth, and and truth with a capital T has been mentioned a couple of times. The end result may not be, and this is just my interpretation of what they said, is not what I believe about this or that, but maybe it's more about who am I? It's about where am I? Am I present? And someone said, are we here at one point? We talked about things like mystics in the first episode, and we talked about Eastern religions in the second. And now, in just a minute after Jill tells us about her art, we're going to talk about quantum mechanics. So after the art, Larry, you can take over from there. Tell us about your art. It's good.
It's really good.
Thank you. There's not a lot to tell. I don't market my art. I don't try to sell my art, although I have sold pieces. But the art I do is mostly acrylics on canvas, and a lot of the times, almost all the time, it just comes from the heart. Sometimes I dream my paintings. They all have some kind of spiritual meaning, just because that's where I come from in my heart. So I have a hard time selling my pieces because they all have such meaning to me. And, I kid Larry that he's lucky because he wrote a book. And when he sells a book, and when he can give a book away, he can sell a book, he still has it. If I give away a painting or sell a painting, I don't have it anymore. So I kind of look at my paintings as my babies. So
yeah,
they all have some kind of spiritual aspect to them.
I love that you do that. And when you were here, did you see like all the paintings that our granddaughters have made around? I can't part with any of those. So I mean, I'm not the creator of them. So, but I hear your heart in not wanting to part with any. I mean, when they paint them, they're like, I'm like, oh, can I keep this, or can I take this to my classroom? And they're like, well, I was going to take it home. And I'm like, of course I let them, I'm not going to go. That's mine. But, yeah, so it's so lovely when you have something that just comes straight from your heart like that. So Yeah.
Sometimes I can let them go after I hold them for a while.
There you go.
Just like your kids when they
That's
grow up,
right.
you have to let
Time
them go.
for you to go now. So is it a part of your spirituality? Do you consider it part of your practices?
Yes, I think it's more an expression of my spirituality rather than a practice of it.
That's really cool.
Okay.
All right, Larry, you're on. Let's talk about quantum mechanics. All right.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to segue a little bit. We ended up talking about panpsychism and the idea that, you have matter and energy and you have consciousness, and does one come from the other? Does the other come from the one? And my favorite quote about panpsychism is that people that study consciousness, they either become panpsychists or they go into college administration. In other words, it's a pretty compelling position when you study it. And it's hard to be definitive, though. There are people that say, "Well, I only believe it if the scientists can prove it," and there just are a lot of things that the scientists cannot prove. I mean, if there is, we've talked about an absolute aspect of existence beyond space and time. How are you going to find out with an instrument? So, just like there are pretty fundamental religious people, there are some fundamental scientists who really practice scientism, and science is their religion. There's nothing outside of it. Now, when you get into intersections of science and spirituality, there's concepts that come up like consciousness. If you know one thing, you know that you're conscious. But if I ask you to define consciousness, you'd have a difficult time doing it. And really, there's not an accepted definition. But the panpsychists say it's everywhere. We can talk about something like energy, and we can say that energy is part of matter, and energy even exists in what we think is blank space. And we all sort of have an intuitive understanding that energy makes things happen. But if I said to you, well, look, it's something that we all experience every day, it's all around us, tell me what energy is, you would have a difficult time. And if I said, well, tell me what God is, we've been talking about that for several sections, and none of us could produce a definitive idea of what God is. And then somebody says, well, you have these three very simultaneously abstract, but also very concrete concepts like consciousness and energy and God. And is consciousness God? Is energy God? It becomes very muddy. Now, I've taken a position that, I'm open to just about anything. I'm very reluctant, though, to attribute something to the supernatural, only because in the past, Aristotle thought, well, humans have souls, animals have different kinds of souls, plants have lesser kinds of souls. That's kind of fallen by the wayside now, and we understand, why or how plants process nutrients. We understand that animals have fight or flight, and it doesn't have anything to do with souls. They used to think that thunder and lightning was the gods making noise, and pretty soon we find out no, there's perfectly reasonable explanations. So when someone encounters mystery or uncertainty or something that's unresolvable, and they're quick to say, well, it's supernatural. See, there's God there. In the book, I talk about the God of the gaps, where historically we thought everything was God, and then we'll know God. Biology, chemistry, and physics explain so much more, so much more, so much more. And so I don't know. I suspect there are things we'll never understand, we'll never explain, we'll never be able to measure. But I'm agnostic about whether that's physical or metaphysical. Something that science can measure, something that spirituality can measure.
In Christian tradition. Let me break in just a minute and ask you a question, because you said mud. It's muddy. That word kind of jolted me back a little bit, because we do trauma recovery. I know you guys don't focus as much on trauma and things like that. We've been through different things, and so we were in a class where we're working on healing that, and then this idea of like focusing of connecting mind and body and so on. They talk about a felt sense. If you have trauma, you have a felt sense of that trauma that happened earlier in your life and so on. So you have a felt sense of it. But then they say, stay with it, and you'll come to, they call it not muddy, but murky. And they say if you stay with that murkiness, eventually that trauma is going to shift and integrate, because we have compassion, and for that part of us. I think it's just important that we can't emphasize enough over and over and over again, and everything we're talking about. The real stuff is not found when someone passes you an assumption, and that makes logical sense to you, so you accept it and you forevermore believe that thing without discovering anything else. The journey of discovery is murky, and it's living in that uncertainty that keeps us growing and moving forward, right? And so I'm sorry to interrupt your train of thought there, but just
No,
I think about that a lot, and how certain I was in the past and how it stopped me.
no, that's well said, and that's consistent with you and I are using the term in the same way.
Yeah.
Okay, so science. There's an interesting contrast. When scientists read the Bible, they say, "Well, I don't think the universe was created 6,000 years ago in 6 days. I think it's more like 13 billion years ago. And I don't think that the universe revolves around the Earth. I think the Earth revolves around the sun, which is part of a galaxy, which is part of an innumerable number of systems. And I don't think there ever was an original perfection. Um, there wasn't one man and one woman that started everything. That's really not how evolution works. Evolution works when there's a bunch of chipmunks, and they're all the same kind of chipmunk. And then for whatever reason, half of them go down one valley and half of them go down the other valley. And in the two valleys, there's very different um,
Conditions.
terrain, vegetation, climate. So they develop different claws, different teeth, different, their fur is different. And some biologist comes along and says, well, this is two different species of chipmunk. It didn't happen because all of a sudden, out of the original chipmunk, a new chipmunk man and a new chipmunk woman mated, and and that's where it came from. So the whole Adam and Eve story, and in the book I say, they can trace your father's father's father, and they can trace you back to the same common ancestor, male ancestor of all of us. They can also trace your mother's 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 mother. They can trace the same common female ancestor. They may have lived thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years apart. And the fact is that there was a population of humanoids that had a complicated family tree, and most of the limbs got lopped off. And so the ones that survive, we trace our common ancestry. But if we all trace our humanity to a common male ancestor and a common male female ancestor, and they weren't in the same place at the same time, there was no snake, there was no apple, there was no tree of good knowledge. It's a story. It's a powerful story. Now, I would contrast all that with the Eastern religions, the Upanishads and the Vedas, where 100 years ago, people like Einstein, people like Oppenheimer studied the Vedic tradition. The Vedic tradition talked about, there's a oneness. And the scientists say, yeah, there certainly is. There's not necessarily, the separation is just apparent, it's not actual. So individuality is not such a thing. And we actually live in fields. The universe is fields, it's not independent objects. The scientists say, yeah, that's actually right. And the quantum physics of 100 years ago really echoed the wisdom of the rishis and the ancient Upanishads. What science discovered 100 years ago was um, there is not there's a subjectivity to our experience. We are not individuals observing a universe that's separate from us. We're actually involved in it, and if we and our observation influences outcomes. If we shine an electron microscope at a particle, it moves. If we're going to study whether light is a particle or a wave, we roll out a wave machine, we see a wave, we said we're done. Somebody says, no, no, let's roll out the other machine just in case. So they roll out a particle machine and light looks like a particle. There's ambiguity. It's not it's not black and white. It's really gray. It's really ambiguous. There's things happening like the absolute and the relative and the particle and the wave and the energy and the matter that seems like it's two things, but it's not. It's one thing. The table is not as solid as you think it is. The air is not as empty as you think it is. There's people that say there's as much energy in, a square meter of cubic meter of space that, it could power the planet, but we can't access it. And there's things like dark energy and dark matter and just whole things that we don't see, we don't understand. Another thing I would recommend to you, we've already recommended a video and a book. There's a book from probably the 70s called The Tao, and that's spelled Tao, of physics. And the subtitle is something like the startling similarities between Eastern mysticism and the new physics. There are things that are just unbelievable. Einstein used to call it spooky action at a distance, where if you have one particle spinning one way and it's entangled, the term's entangled with another particle. If you reverse the spin on this particle, no matter how far away it is, instantaneously the other particle will reverse its spin. And you say, well, what in the universe could be entangled? Well, if you believe that there was a Big Bang, and most scientists do, and that it was a singularity, and that the whole universe was packed into a pinhead, everything is entangled. So all of a sudden, when somebody says, I just don't understand your, all this stuff about connection and subjectivity and entanglement, sounds like woo-woo stuff to me. I just say, read the science. Read the science. And so it's terribly compelling to have the mystics tell you, look, there's only one thing that matters. I mean, everyone's related, everyone's connected. Have the Eastern religions tell you there's the fundamental truth of the universe is, everyone's related, everything's connected. And then the quantum physicists say, truth with a capital T is our physical universe. They're not talking about some metaphysical beyond space and time, but physical universe, everyone's related, everything's connected. It's really a compelling perspective that's I think life-changing.
I would recommend a book, whatever you think about Rob Bell. He's at least a deep thinker. And he has a book called Everything is Spiritual. And it discusses those things. Everything's connected. It's bigger than we thought. It's more connected than we thought, and so on. And he does it from a real judicious way, not just condemning one thing, and he's just telling about his experience and what he's realizing and so on. It's a real good book if you're not as deep into the study and so on as you are, and it might be a good place to start, as well as Larry's book. And just call Larry up and have a conversation with him. That'll be fun for you too, and I don't think he'd even mind that. But
I would love that. I would love that. Yeah.
So the double slit experiment, can you talk about that a little bit? What that may be off topic a little bit, but can you mention that?
No, it's what I alluded to, that they fire a light beam at two slits, and sometimes the pattern suggests that that light is a wave, and sometimes it's a particle. Sometimes where the particles or waves of light land are really diffracted, and sometimes they're really concentrated. And it's like the experiment of Schrodinger's cat, which is another famous quantum physical experiment, where they say, well, just imagine that there's a cat and we put some poisonous gas in there, and the cat's either alive or dead. When you open the box, we really live in a probabilistic universe where there is a wave function where in some situations the cat's dead, in some situations the cat's alive, and when you open the box, you collapse the wave function, and it is either dead or alive. The light going through the slits, in some capacities it looks like a particle, in some it looks like a wave, but you can measure location, or you can measure momentum, but you can't measure both at the same time. And so all this energy, matter, particle wave, dead or alive, we think of those things as being very distinct uh, outcomes. But Schrodinger would say, well, no, it's there's nothing resolved until you observe it, until it's measured, until the wave function collapses.
But sometimes it has to do with who's looking at it or
Yes.
things like that. We just never think along those lines normally.
Relativity, Einstein discovered relativity. And if you have identical twins and shoot one of them up in a rocket, they age differently. Time is the only constant is the speed of light. Time is a construct. Space is a construct. Time and space are space-time, a continuum. Gravity bends space. Gravity bends light. It's just eye-popping. I mean, there's so much, and some people ask me, why? I don't even understand what you call spirituality. I don't understand why you're a spiritual person. I don't understand why you wrote a book. I said, well, because my understanding has shifted, and spirituality to me means a connection to something bigger. And to me, it's the most important thing. And I don't have to have an opinion about what that something bigger is. But when the mystics see it and the Eastern religions see it and the scientists see it, I believe that. I believe it.
So it's what did I observe, not what I imagined, right? Or what I created or what I heard somebody else say. Well, how can, I think there are a lot of us that get overwhelmed when we start thinking about something like that. Now, remember, we get all our science from the Big Bang Theory TV show. I'm just kidding. Remember one time when Sheldon became a pedestrian so that he could solve some riddle, and I just remember him saying, "It's a wave. It's not a part. It doesn't move like a particle, or something like that." Anyway, I'm slightly kidding, but
no, I get it.
A lot of things
and
resonate.
People, when I talk about our spirituality, people say, "Well, you don't even sound like you're sure that there is a God, or that you can identify what type of God that is, or anything. I mean, you must just be a cynical, nihilistic, question everything kind of person." And you don't know me. I mean, the people that know me say that's the furthest thing from Larry and Jill Jordan. They are joyful people. And,
I can confirm
I'll
that.
speak for myself, but I think Jill's in the same place. I have awe. You know, I like you say, it's murky. I don't understand what it is or where it comes from. I know enough about it to say this is really awesome. And I don't have to speculate about anybody or anything. I just look around me and I say, this is awesome. I have reverence, It doesn't mean that I worship a creator, but I have reverence for however this happened and however I happened to be here. I mean, I could have been in a lot of places or no place at all, but I happen to be plopped right in the middle of this absolutely wondrous universe. And, I have a sense of responsibility. I feel like I'm part of the whole. So I have an obligation to the people and the things around me. I feel like my life is terribly important. I've had 66 years so far. I might not have another, I might have 30 more. But to me, I don't really think I'm going anyplace else. I don't really think I'm coming back. I don't know how either one of those outcomes could happen. So this 66 years at any time I have left is terribly important. It's all I've got. I have one shot. And people sometimes say to me, well, what's your goal? What's your big thing? Little things. You know, Jill and I talk sometime about a friend of ours whose father-in-law passed away. He was a business owner, he's a veteran. He had a family, there was all kinds of things that a traditional obituary would say about him. This was not a traditional obituary. It said he grows plants, he plays with children, he walks dogs, he sings songs, and at the end of his life, all of his belongings fit in 11 boxes. To me, that's the most beautiful obituary I've ever read. It basically says that the big thing is little things. You know, it's playing with your grandchildren. It's looking at the snow on the mountains. It's it's enjoying a vacation with your wife. That's what counts.
Yeah. You're answering a question I was just about to ask. And so I want to ask it to Jill also. Just a deconstructing Christian and someone who's out there's dismayed with Christianity, or they just want to find some real answers, and they're tired of the rat race or whatever. And maybe they were an investment banker like you were and realized they needed to serve people or whatever. And so, Jill, how do the average person is looking for some peace, um, some meaning, some happiness, some joy. Like we say, we don't want to say, well, this is the beliefs you should have, this is what you should believe. But I want to ask Jill, how do what would you say to people that are like that? What kind of journey they're on, what they're coming out of. What would you give them as wisdom?
That's a big question.
I know. Tend to ask questions like that, but
I think the first thing I would say, and I know that Larry would agree with this because he says that all the time too, don't hold your beliefs so tightly. Be willing to explore a little bit and let go a little bit of what you have held on to your whole life. And what we're talking about today, don't be afraid to study science. Spirituality and science are not mutually exclusive. They're very connected. Let go of your fear. Just look around and find the joy in everyday small things. And don't be afraid to give up things that don't work for you anymore. It goes back to the fear that Laura's been talking about. Try to let go of that fear. And just find the connection and the love, and just allow yourself to be immersed in that. I mean,
I've answered this. I've answered this question before, and I've said connection. Where do you find connection? Pursue that. That's what this.
And you can find that.
Connected.
And you can find that in many different places.
Yeah.
Many different places.
Yeah.
And that's good. You don't have to just find one connection and stay there.
Yeah.
I think that's the hardest thing too, when people come out of religion, at least the people that we've talked to, is, that is one of their biggest fears, or one of the biggest things that people say to them. One of the biggest questions they ask them is, well, where are you going to find your community? In other words, where are you going to find your connection? If not inside this building, where are you going to find that? And I 100% agree with you that there's connection to be found in so many places. I feel that we have very true, genuine, authentic connection, even with people such as yourselves that we've only physically seen maybe twice, right? We've talked many times. The connection can be found in so many places. Yeah.
Well, and on that same line, so can, quote, God.
Yes.
Can be found at different places in different ways. And if you are somebody that's always been hung up on prayer, you can change your idea about prayer. Prayer can be doing a painting. Prayer can be listening to music. Prayer can be walking in the woods. Prayer can be all kinds of things.
Right.
And so can God.
Yeah.
You can see God in your grandson's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
You can see God in holding your puppy. You can see God in, serving at the mission, serving meal. There's so many different places that you can find God, and not just in church.
Right.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's better.
Yeah. And I think one fear of most ex-Christians or deconstructing Christians, the fear is that if we if we explore things, then it's dangerous and something's going to jump on us and infect us, and we're going to be terrible people. And I just don't see that. I know there's people that are bringing their old roots with them, and they have issues and problems and so on. But some of the shittiest people I know are diehard fundamentalist Christians, and some of the best people I know are people that don't even claim a specific belief system, but they've somehow tapped into the goodness of the universe, and they're somehow living that out, even without a formal creed or even a scripture sometimes or a holy book to guide them, right? It's just the interaction with people, the experiencing genuine love, maybe even seeing that. I don't know.
And if you're
one other,
no, go ahead. I was just going to say, if you're a deconstructing Christian, I would tell you, okay, forget about what you have been told for years and years and years in your church, and just look at Jesus' life. Look at what he did. Look at who he ate with and who he talked with and who he walked with.
Yeah.
Listen to the words he said, and make up your own mind. You don't have to believe what all the pastors or priests or whatever have told you. You have to believe. If you are a diehard Christian, look at Jesus' life. I mean, Larry and I don't really, I shouldn't talk for you maybe, but I don't identify myself as a Christian anymore, but I still follow Jesus. And you can do that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in the West, we are all about labels, and it doesn't have to be that way.
I agree.
Yeah. And we sometimes say, if you're following Jesus, you're also following Krishna and Buddha and Lao Tzu for much of the way.
Right.
And I guess one thing I would say, just to conclude, when you think about the world of connectedness, part of the way that you behave is not to follow rules and not necessarily to intellectualize things. Is just to try and discover what is the way of the universe, whether it's intentional or not. I can either, as they say, gently down the stream, life is but a dream. There's a way to, as we say sometimes, go with the flow of the universe, and there's a way to paddle upstream and keep banging into rocks and stuff. And in the East, there's very much of an understanding of the more that this idea of connectedness percolates into you, the more that you will realize the natural way, the more that you will be selfless, not selfish. And a good rule of thumb is what is the least selfish, most selfless thing I could do? When I was an investment banker, I'd say, elevate what's the right thing for the deal. Not talking about me, not talking about my client, not talking about you, not talking about your client, not talking about the investors, not talking about the kids that are going to this school. We're all serving the common purpose here. We're getting a deal done. What is the right thing for the deal? And so the connectedness elevates you outside of your own egotistical, what's right for me, what's right for us. And there becomes a naturalness to your way of living. You just sort of intuitively understand the right thing for us, the right thing for the deal, the way to attain the most good and the least harm.
Yeah, that's a good way to stop.
Thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary podcast.
Remember, all who wander in the desert are not lost.
We believe all of our stories are sacred.
We are always here if you need someone to hear your story.
Check out our blog on Pathos and also our YouTube channel.
And stay tuned for our Leaning Forward conference.
Remember, we love you.
And be at peace.